So I'm actually going to be borrowing from Leibniz's argument, cosmological argument. The reason why I'm doing that is Leibniz is kind of considered a more of a modern, since he comes from more the 17th century, 18th century, around there. But it's kind of easier to explain some of his arguments because with Aquinas and Aristotle and all these other guys, they have like terminology that's a little bit difficult to explain. But today I'm basically going to talk about the existence and attributes of God. So you probably heard atheists kind of say something to the effect like, oh, well, you say there's an ultimate cause of the universe, but that cause could have just been a multiverse. It could have just been a flying spaghetti monster if they're trying to mock your theistic views. It could just be anything that's not God, or you could have multiple gods. They may say like, well, what makes you think your God is so special? There's like maybe a line of gods. You have Zeus, you have all these other gods lined up, just in a row, and you suddenly choose Yahweh. Well, why? So the thing I want to make clear here is that, well, I'm going to be talking about making an argument for a general monotheism. So I'm not going to be defending any particular version. Like, I'm not going to say, okay, Christianity is the truth, even though I think it follows more naturally from it. And I may be able to explain why it fits better with what we're describing God here, but for the most part, I'm just going to be focused on a general kind of monotheism, or philosophical theism, as they call it, just to kind of like show like, hey, it has all the traditional attributes of God, and that this God has to be the only one that could possibly be God. It's not like this God he just happened to get the job position. He just happened to get the interview and be like, yep, I'm God for thousands or millions of years, and then some other God dethrones him or something. Rather, this God is the only possible God, the only conceivable God that could ever be God. So I'm going to go into that. So we're going to break this up into parts, actually. So the first part, I'm just going to focus on Leibniz's cosmological argument. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to focus on proving that there has to be a necessary being. So I'm going to prove that there has to be some being that caused everything, basically, that explains everything that exists. But, I'm not going to say yet that is God. We don't know what it is. That necessary being could, at least for the moment, could seem to be something else. It could maybe be something physical. It could be something that's less than God. At least that seems possible at first glance. But I'm going to show you why that's not possible. But as long as we get the first step, which is that there's a necessary being, we can get to a God with the traditional divine attributes. So, without further ado, let me ask, this is how Leibniz's cosmological argument starts. I think it's actually the ultimate question that we can ask. Why is there something rather than nothing? I think whenever you look at existence, if you ever pondered it, if you ever looked at the stars and just gazed at them in awe and thinking of all the history of the great men of old, the great heroes of old, all the great wars of old, you just think, man, did all that have to exist? Why did that exist? Why did any of this exist? Why do I exist? In fact, you may become of a sense of awe and thinking that there's a time in which I did not exist. And that's kind of almost hard to imagine sometimes, because we're only aware of ourselves existing. That's the only time, because we exist. We have self-awareness is when we exist. We're not aware of a time in which we don't exist, but we know it's possible. We know it's actual. And yet that question seems to linger in us. Why is there something rather than nothing? It's the ultimate question because it's about existence altogether. It's the most important question, I think, because you can't philosophize, you can't do science, you can't have fun, you can't do anything if you don't exist. And so as Aristotle says, philosophy begins with a sense of wonder. And I think this question is something that all of us have to face at some point. The atheist, the theist, we all have to face this question. So that leads us to something like a principle of sufficient reason. We think that whatever exists must have an explanation of its existence. It seems perfectly natural to expect that. We see that in science. We see when we ask, okay, why is there rain? Why is there plants? We can't have all kinds of explanations that we find when we ask these mini questions, like why does that exist? Why does that particular thing exist? So when we have all kinds of answers, all kinds of explanations for those particular things. But when we ask then the ultimate question, it seems to be no different. We're just asking at a bigger scale, but it's still the same question. Why is there something rather than nothing? And then so we seem to have a natural expectation for explanations. And so another way to put this is a more kind of technical way, a more Thomistic way, but everything is intelligible in itself, but not always to us. So what that means, intelligibility is something that makes sense. There's an explanation for why that thing exists and why it is the way it is. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be available to us, though. There's a lot of things, for example, in quantum mechanics that seems very difficult to understand, but it still exists and it has some explanation for why it occurs. That's why science is investigating these things. It wouldn't investigate them if they didn't think there could possibly be any answers. So when we're searching for explanations, we see that, you know, the universe seems to be very intelligible through and through. You know, even if we can't figure out all the time what that answer is, we expect that. We discover that consistently. Over and over, we find explanations. Why does lightning exist? Oh, because of this particular process, this particular physical process. You know, and if you're an evolutionist, you know, you might believe that also that humans came about through a certain evolutionary process. You have some kind of explanation for those things. So you might not always understand everything, but everything is intelligible in itself, even if we can't ourselves understand it, even if it's beyond our understanding because we have finite, limited minds. So this is what we call the principle of sufficient reason. It's like a law of thought. It's a law of reality that rules over all reality, that governs reality. So there might be some objections. So we're going to try to like say, look, some people might say, well, principle of sufficient reason, what, it doesn't have to apply everywhere. It doesn't have to apply universally. But if that's the case, you know, otherwise things could just pop into being if you make that position. Why don't we see zebras popping into existence right now? Why don't we see just things coming into being without any cause? And we know we never see that kind of chaos in our world, but we would expect it if there is no law governing all possible reality, that there is no reason why this could not happen. You know, it seems like something external could happen. If you want to say some people say the universe is a closed system. That way, that means nothing can change. You know, it's following the laws of physics. That's why nothing pops into being from nothing. But nonetheless, there's no reason why something just external to the universe can't pop into existence from nothing and then intrude in our universe in that sense and just kind of mess up everything. You know, there's no reason that cannot occur. There's nothing preventing that. Metaphysically speaking, when we're talking about big picture stuff, there's no reason why that could not occur. So this is actually an argument for the principle of sufficient reason. Because, you know, we don't see this happening, and then you have to explain why don't we see that happening. If the principle of sufficient reason is not a law that applies universally to every possible world that could possibly exist, then it should be the case that things should pop into existence from nothing, at least sometimes, right? But that never happens. And that seems to be best explained by the fact that this principle of sufficient reason is an actual universal law. And things can't just be magically popping out of nothing from nowhere. And then another thing about the principle of sufficient reason, if you reject it, the PSR is like punching yourself in the face. So rejecting this principle of sufficient reason is like punching yourself in the face. It's a contradiction. So for example, like say you're a skeptic and you think, well, why should I accept this principle as true though? What reasons do we have? Well, besides the other reason, I gave you the empirical reason, right? I give you the reason that we keep finding consistently explanations. That's kind of like the inductive argument in a way. Like we're consistently finding explanations over and over for millions and millions of things. Why shouldn't the PSR then be universal? Why shouldn't PSR be true? That's an empirical argument. Now, here's another argument that we could give. You know, well, besides the poofing out of existence thing, that's an argument also. It says that if the PSR is not true, then it would lead to absurd consequences. Now we have a third argument, which is like skeptics must assume it. So if they're asking why should we accept the PSR as true, they're actually assuming the PSR, because remember, PSR is like there has to be a sufficient reason why something exists, or if you apply it to more like the thought of how we reason, it also applies to we have to have a reason for why we believe a certain way. You know, it seems to be a fundamental thing. Like I can't just say, yeah, I believe, you know, the virus came from some lizards underground, you know. And people were like thinking like, what are you talking about? Lizards, you know, passed on, or like some 5G tower or something. You might have some crazy kind of theory and like, oh yeah, I just pooped into existence or something like that. And you might say, well, that's absurd. Why do you think that? Well, a person might say, just because, you know. But we think that's ridiculous. You have to have reasons for why you believe a certain thing. It's just fundamental to the law of thought. It's how we think. It's how we reason. So for skeptics asking, why is the principle of sufficient reason true? They're assuming the principle of sufficient reason is true in order to even question it. And so the principle of sufficient reason is so fundamental, it's so basic that you can't even reject it without assuming it, without leading to a contradiction. And then another argument is that it actually destroys all knowledge if you reject the principle of sufficient reason. So, for example, something like you have a belief that other minds exist, and you might have this belief, but then you may think, I have this belief because of reasons, particular reasons. I see and observe certain actions from people, and I see that they have thought that mimics the kind of thought that I have, that has the exact same kind of thought process in some ways. So you might say, yeah, that gives me reasons to believe. But then, if you reject the principle of sufficient reason, that destroys everything, because principle of sufficient reason saying that there are certain causal processes, for example, your sensory mechanisms. Your sensory mechanisms are properly receiving the object that's right in front of you and then transferring that and then converting that into your mind so that you can properly understand what it is that you're seeing in front of you. And then you're kind of producing that as a reason for what you do. So if principle of sufficient reason is not true, if there is no explanation for why you have those particular thought processes, for example, then you couldn't justify those thought processes. Your reasoning, your beliefs are without any reason. So it ends up destroying all knowledge, all possible knowledge, if you reject this principle of sufficient reason. So I think it leads to all kinds of problems that we should cause us to, accept it. So now there are two types of explanations, though, for under, PSR, what I would call the principle of sufficient reason. So that kind of explanation is what we call as contingent. So contingent is just that which depends on something else for its existence. So it can fail to exist. So there's my hamster, Luffy. It's an actual picture of him. He loved to stare at me while I was reading books. So he's a funny little guy. And this little guy, he had only a 3-year lifespan. He failed to exist. He came to existence at one point and failed to exist at another point. That means that his existence was contingent. He can fail to exist. He didn't have to exist. His existence actually depends on all kinds of different things and factors. His existence depended on food, depended on me to care for it, provide for it, and all kinds of different factors. Physical laws being held in place at that particular moment, that molecular structure being held together in order for that hamster to exist. So Luffy exists because of different explanations when now all come to explain his existence. And the same thing with, like, say, computers or tablets or phones or books, everything that we see, they came into existence because humans caused it. Humans brought it into being. They had an idea in their head and they used some kind of machine to produce it. And then we also have creation itself. When we look at the beauty of the stars, look at the mountains, and we see through science that all this was formed, but it didn't always exist this way. The earth didn't always exist. The stars didn't always exist. They all came to be in some way through some kind of scientific process. So all these things depend on different things in order for them to exist. You and I exist because only because our parents caused us to exist. But that's not the only sense in which we are contingent. Like, you and I are contingent because we began to exist, but we're also contingent because every moment in which we do exist here and now, we depend on the molecular structure, the chemical structure, the atomic structure being held in place, and that the laws of physics are being held in place. So every second of our existence, we depend on those things. So it applies not just to our previous existence, like what caused us, but also to our current existence, what's continually holding us in existence at this very moment, at every instant in time. So our parents could die, but yet we would still live. So we're not completely dependent on our parents. We're dependent to be brought into existence, but we're not dependent to continue to exist. So the important thing to recognize is that distinction. To continue to exist is something that we're going to be using here, because I'm not concerned, at least with the Leibniz cosmological argument, is not concerned with something beginning to exist. In fact, Leibniz's cosmological argument is actually fairly interesting because it concedes that maybe the universe is eternal. Maybe you have an eternity of multiverses. So keep that in mind here, because it's going to make a big difference in terms of how this argument gets elaborated here. So I just want to make that clear, that that's what contingency is. Contingency is something that's caused to exist, but also continuously caused to exist by something else, which is that molecular structure, laws of physics, and all those other things. So that's what it means to be contingent. So that's the first type of explanation when it comes to, how we seek to explain things. We're seeking to explain things in terms of some other contingent cause. So you explaining my existence by my parents' existence. You explain my parents' existence by their parents' existence. That was a contingent series of causes explaining their existence. Now we have another type of explanation. That explanation is called necessary explanations. So all that means is that which does not depend on anything else for its existence. It cannot possibly fail to exist. It's impossible. It has to exist. So common examples of what we do, like analogies anyways, for what we consider necessary, are like mathematics. So 1 + 1 = 2. That's always true. It's necessarily true. Once we examine the concept of what it is to be the number one and what it is to actually have the addition sign, what it is to have an equal sign, we examine the concepts and their relations to each other, we necessarily derive that it has to be the number 2. That's what it equals. And that's necessarily true. And so too of triangles, you know, they all add up. He has a 3-sided closed plane figure that adds up to 180 degrees. That's necessarily true in every possible world. There's no world in which that is false. It's necessarily true. Another example would be the laws of logic, you know, like law of non-contradiction. So basically the law of non-contradiction says that a TV or something cannot be both a TV and not a TV at the same time and in the same sense, right? So that would be a contradiction. You're making incoherent sense, you know? So laws of logic seem to apply, you know? So when we talk about reality itself, a tree is a tree. A tree is not going to also be a hamster or a house all at the same time. It's either just a tree or it's not a tree. It's one or the other. So these are called the laws of logic, or the laws of identity too. You know, A is A. I'm Gil. You know, I'm identical to myself. That's just necessarily true. So these are necessary truths, things that have to exist no matter what. Even if the world didn't exist, say the physical world didn't exist, these are things that have to be. Most philosophers concede, for example, that these things would be existing as maybe some kind of abstract object or what have you, or however you want to cash that out, like David Lewis would cash it out in terms of multiverses. These are things that have to exist in every possible world. There's just no denying them without contradiction, without making no sense of the world. So now we have these two explanations. Now we can actually proceed to the argument itself for God's existence. This is, again, Leibniz's cosmological argument. So premise 1, it states, whatever exists must have an explanation of its existence. So either that explanation is contingent or necessary. So we went through this. It's just the principle sufficient reason. This is what premise 1 is. It relies on that. So there's only 2 types of explanations. So that seems intuitive, and we know that that seems pretty reasonable. So common sense person will accept that. Now, premise 2, the universe is contingent. So that just means the universe doesn't have to exist. It didn't need to exist. You know, and science shows this, you know, like it began to exist. If we talk about the Big Bang, it began to exist. It didn't have to exist the way it is. It didn't have to take the path, the course of historical events that it did. You know, it could have been otherwise. We could have imagined that I was dead, for example, as morbid as that might seem. I can imagine that I was dead and that didn't exist, and things would be different. We wouldn't be having this conversation. There'd be a lot of different events in history that would not be taking place. There's no reason that I have to exist, you know. So that this contingency means that we can conceive of something of different. We can conceive of different universes. And this has a lot of support in science. You know, we have all kinds of multiverses we can conceive of, or even argue for, as some people in quantum mechanics tend to argue for. So that second premise seems pretty plausible. Whoops, I don't want to get there yet. Okay. So this third premise is that an infinite series of contingent things cannot explain the universe's existence. So I think this is really intuitively plausible. So basically it's saying, like, okay, even if you're like an atheist, so an atheist will typically say, oh, well, maybe there's an infinity of multiverses proceeding through infinite time. You know, there is without end, it's eternal. So this is where the eternality aspect of this argument goes. It assumes the atheist is right. It assumes that, okay, you have an eternal series, infinite series of time has passed by. But even with that, even if you do have an infinite series, that doesn't explain the universe's existence at all. So for example, let's suppose that I want to borrow a pencil. And in order to borrow a pencil, I ask my friend. But my friend doesn't have that pencil either. So he's like, yeah, I'm going to actually ask Josh. I think he may have a pencil. So he asked Josh. And Josh doesn't have it either, though. So he asked Matt. And Matt asked Tom. Tom asked Aaron. Neither of them have a pencil. And it goes on for infinity. Well, if that goes on for infinity, is anybody going to get a pencil? If no one has the pencil, I'm never going to get the pencil, you know, because Tom doesn't have it, Aaron doesn't have it, you know, Allie doesn't have it, Elizabeth doesn't have it. None of you guys have the pencil. So contingent things is like that. When we're talking about contingent things, they don't have existence in themselves. They always get existence from something else. But if that's something else contingent, then that contingent thing does not have existence. So it has to get existence from something else. But that thing itself doesn't have contingency existence in its own, so it has to get it from somewhere else. But then you continue going to infinity, you don't explain anything. All you get is a non-explanation. So that's a big problem. It violates the PSR, as we see in premise 1. It cannot explain it. We need an explanation of the universe existence. So since an infinite series of contingent things cannot explain the universe existence, therefore there must exist a necessary being that explains the universe existence. So this seems to be the most plausible. You only have these two options. Either something contingent explains it or something necessary explains it. So this is what we call a necessary being. So we haven't really argued yet for this necessary being having a divine attributes, because you're going to see atheists are going to kind of argue, oh, well, why couldn't that necessary being be like a physical universe? Or why couldn't it be like some kind of bit of matter or some arrangement of like some quantum field or something? Why couldn't that simply be necessary? So the thing is that most atheists are actually not going to accept this. They usually want to avoid at all costs the idea that there is a necessary being, even if it is a physical necessary being. Like 75%, I would say, would reject this proposal. They would simply say, well, we don't have an explanation. Maybe science will figure it out. But whatever science is going to figure out, either it's going to figure out something that's contingent or it's going to figure out something that's necessary. So science is not, if it finds something, science discovers something that's a contingent explanation of the world, it didn't have to exist. They really haven't ultimately explained anything still. You have to ultimately get to something that's necessary. So this whole idea that, oh, science is going to figure it out, it's simply a cop-out. It's a way to avoid answering the question, meeting the demands of reason. So they're trying to take on the baton of being heroes of common sense, of reason, and that theists are simply the ones who are kind of irrational. But if you think about a lot of actual atheists are going to argue that most 75% anyways, are going to argue that there is no such necessary being. And then 25% of atheists that do, I think, are the most reasonable. In fact, if I was an atheist, I would say there's a necessary being, and that necessary being would be a physical universe. So that seems to be the most plausible way to be an atheist. But unfortunately, most new atheists today anyways simply don't have any explanation at all. And if they do try to say, well, science will explain it, but science is in the business of finding contingent explanations. You're not going to find necessary explanations in science. Science actually, if anything, presupposes, for example, math. It assumes that they're accurate. It assumes that these things take place, that they're true, that 1 + 1 = 2. They presuppose the laws of logic. They presuppose that these laws of logic actually apply to the physical world. They assume that the method of induction of trying to arrive at, multiple cases and then saying, okay, we have the scientific method, for example, is saying, okay, this verifies our claim, we're making predictions. You're assuming certain philosophical ideas. That's what science does. Science cannot stand on its own. In fact, science was created by philosophy. So I think the natural conclusion, if you're going to be reasonable and you're going to accord with common sense, you're not going to reject science and just simply make a cop-out and say, oh, well, everything in the world needs an explanation, but except the universe. That's the only thing that doesn't need explanation. If you're not going to do something like that, then they're going to reasonably see that this conclusion necessarily these premises necessarily lead to conclusion. So okay, yeah.
Can we ask questions, or you want us to wait till you finish?
Yeah, you can ask questions.
So you might have already addressed this with the pencil illustration, but I have a physics friend, physics professor at Weber State. It always says it's that we used to know what lightning caused lightning, but now we do know.
Oh yeah.
Yep. Was that the pencil illustration, or?
That's a different objection, actually. So the thing is, that's called God did it, or God of the gaps. That's an objection to theism, where we can't explain how lightning got here. We can't explain how humans got here. Therefore, God did it. That seems to be like the caricature that atheists kind of present the theistic position. But if you study anything about philosophy, all the way to Aristotle, it's never been the case. So what this argument does, for example, what makes it completely distinct from those is that we're arguing from what we do know. For example, we argue from what we do know, which is that the world is contingent, that there are contingent things, that there has to be an explanation for those things, so that there's only one possible explanation for those things, one possible, even conceivable explanation, and that would be a necessary being. So it's like, the law of elimination, process of elimination. It's either this or that. Either men are mortal or they're not mortal. Either they're capable of dying or they're not capable of dying. So like there's no middle ground. This is the law of excluded middle, for example. It's not like you can say, oh yeah, well, they both, that's a contradiction. So in the same way, what we're doing here is that we're saying either something is contingent or it's necessary. That exhausts the possibilities here, at least as far as reason's concerned. As far as like, if you want to be acting according with common sense, you want to act in accord with what we know to be true of science and everything, then insofar as you do so, then there are only two options. So this isn't an argument from ignorance. This is an argument of God with gaps. It's rather an argument for what we do know. We know that the world is contingent to the only possible explanation, which is that a necessary being has to create the universe.
Could I add something to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Tom, the pencil illustration is just meant to highlight that infinite regressions aren't possible. If like a series of causations, like I exist because my mom created me, my mom exists because her mom created me, and so on and so on and so on. If that goes on forever, then no one will ever exist. That's all the pencil illustration is meant to highlight. So there has to be some cause at the beginning, which doesn't depend on anything else.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So it doesn't matter what the atheist tries to do here. They could say, well, there's an infinite universe. What explains that infinite universe? Well, they can say an infinite amount of multiverses. And then you have another series of infinite that causes that infinite series. Doesn't matter. You go in any series of infinites that you add upon that, it's still going to be no explanation. It's like me adding, okay, an infinite series of people I can borrow pencils from, but none of them have the pencil. So I'm not going to get the pencil no matter how infinite that series is. So that's meant to show that no matter how many infinites of contingent things you have, you're not going to explain anything. You ultimately need something that's going to be necessary, that has to exist. And so this necessary being is something that exists by necessity of its own nature. It's not like we arbitrarily stipulate it. Oh, it's necessary because I say so. It's because we need it to explain any existence at all. So for example, say I do have the pencil, and then you're kind of, okay, you in fact know that I have a pencil. So then you realize, well, someone must have gave you that pencil then. And so if you go back to series, I took the pencil from Ali took the pencil from Tom, and ultimately it came from Aaron. Say Aaron made the pencil. He's a, I don't know, pencil artist or something. He makes pencils, so he has a bunch of pencils in his closet. So, we have some explanation then for why I got that pencil. So a necessary being then is something like, it has existence in itself. It's something that, we need to, in order to explain it, we have existence. We know what things exist. We see it, we feel it. I know that I exist. Same things to how I know a pencil exists. So then, since I know a pencil exists,
Sorry to interject. So I want to break this down to the most irreducible part. It's probably been already said, but this whole a quickie on how that statement, we know that the universe is contingent. Those words, we know that the universe is contingent. I just want to reproduce if I've got that right. It's because any given thing we see physically, like a pencil, like you, like me, has an explanation, and therefore the whole thing does. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, in some way, like say, for
everything
example,
contingently explainable or explain, or sorry, yeah. Hopefully, go ahead.
Okay, so you're kind of asking, how do we know that the universe is contingent, right?
Well, that whole statement, because I just think I think you sufficiently explained it. I think I just missed it along the way. You started with smaller things, and that statement that we know that the universe is contingent, and again, that's because any given thing or item in the universe, the definition of contingent means that it has an explanation as per the PSR. That's what PSR means.
Yeah, PSR is just basically in principle sufficient reason. Everything that exists has an explanation, whether it's necessary or it's going to be contingent. So we know that the universe is contingent, I think, because it changes, because it's not always been the way that it is, because we can also, second reason why is because we can conceive of it in being differently. Even scientists say, like the anthropic principle, for example, if we just finely tuned anything, just even like change numbers even slightly, which is possible. All physicists say this is possible. You can finally change any of the numbers of the physical laws of physics. We could have had a different world. So we can conceive of that without any contradiction. It's not like I can conceive of a square triangle. I can't conceive of that because that's a contradiction. But I can conceive of a different universe. I can't conceive of this universe not existing without contradiction, which shows that it is contingent. That doesn't have to exist, because if I can conceive of that without contradiction, then I've succeeded in demonstrating that it is contingent. And also because it changes too. Like I said, like the Big Bang Theory, we know we have all kinds of different changes. Something that's necessary doesn't change. If you see that like 1 + 1 = 2, that never changes. It's never the case that for tomorrow it's going to be 3 for tomorrow for a day, and then the rest of the year it's going to be 1 + 1 = 2, right? It never changes necessarily true. So in the same case, if the universe is necessary, then it has to be static world. It can't change, but we see change all the time. So that really demonstrates that it's not necessary, because things that we do that are necessary don't change. They're kind of they stay the same way. So that's that question. So
I don't know if it'd be helpful to define contingent being as if something that did not exist at one time, and then that is a contingent being. It came into being. It came into existence. So basically, like you and I are contingent beings because we did not exist at one time. So I find that just to be a simplistic definition of what a contingent being is. What we're all contingent because we did not exist at one time.
Yeah. So.
To add to where I think you're going with this, I had a question. What did you think of David Hume's argument basically for agnosticism?
Agnosticism?
Yeah, basically his argument was that because from what your last comment there, you could even put it back. It basically is that therefore we came from a being. But then what Hume basically argued was that we say from motion, we see a billiard ball A move towards billiard ball B, but and then of course billiard ball A stops and then B moves, and then we say A caused B to move. But then what does cause look like? What does it smell like? What does it feel like? All we see is one action and another action, but we actually don't see cause itself. So he's arguing for agnosticism in that sense, and that we don't know cause. We only infer cause and not actually observe cause.
Yeah. So Hume is arguing causality. So the thing is, make sure the difference is that explanations are not all explanations are causes. All causes are explanations, but not all explanations are causes. So like, for example, God's explanation of his existence, if we're going to get to that, but God's explanation of existence is his own nature. He just necessarily exists by his own nature. That's what his explanation for his existence is, because he necessarily exists because his nature entails that. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a cause, like God causes himself to exist. That would be nonsense. Like I'm bringing myself. How can you cause yourself to exist? If you already exist, you don't cause yourself to exist. You already exist to cause yourself to exist. So that's the first thing to make a distinction between here and Leibniz's cosmological argument. It doesn't depend on causality. Now, with respect to Hume, though, I think Hume is just being ridiculous. For how I think we do know, for example, I'm sorry to say it, but Hume I think is overrated. Hume is saying that we don't actually have any direct awareness of causation. We don't see causation itself, but I do, because I see my thoughts causing certain other thoughts. I perceive that. I see directly how my rational thoughts are perceiving it. So this is Berkeley's response. Berkeley actually anticipated Hume. I think it's brilliant, his response, I think, because it's saying that you know that your thoughts are causing. You're perceiving causation itself in your own head, in your mind, when you're thinking certain things, when you're going through a line of reasoning, you are perceiving a certain type of causation there. And in fact, when I see the billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, I am seeing something cause another thing. It's just question begging to say that I'm not. I am seeing causation right there in front of me. It seems to be best explained by the fact that that ball really is causing that other ball to move. This is just basic common sense. It's science. And so the problem with Hume is that he undermines all science, his Gnosticism was way too radical, and I think he'd be self-refuted. In fact, Hume is so bad that he doesn't even know he exists, because he thinks that he could just be a collective collection of conscious experiences, but never, there's no I, there's no me. He doesn't think he can know that. And I think we can know that, and it's just obviously true that we do know that. So I can go a lot into Hume. We can talk about Elizabeth Anscombe and all these other great philosophers that have really, I think, successfully refuted Hume. But that would be beyond the scope of this argument, because we're focusing more on explanations. So causality is a part of explanations, but it's not the whole thing. So I just kind of, I want to go back now into the actual argument here for a bit, if you guys don't mind. So,
I think you make a good point about that, but I think his input is valid, because the approach that you're going with, this is a kind of like a deductive reasoning back from now to then, from here to there, from me to God. Is
you mean inductive? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there is a gap. Not to say God are the gaps, but to say that there is a gap from me to God. And so the question is about that gap, and I think the agnosticism that is brought up is valid to question that. But yes, his arguments do lead basically into total skepticism of everything.
Mm-hmm. Which is absurd, because I think we refuted that by showing that I do have direct experience of causation with my own mind and thoughts. So if I have that, then I do know causation exists. I don't need to make an inductive argument, or I don't need to make an inference. I am simply perceiving it directly and immediately, causation, when I'm experiencing thoughts. So I think that gap is not really a valid gap. I think it's just, if we consider it, it just leads to absurdities, and that absurdity is that he ends up denying his own existence, and we know that that's just false. Now, I want to go back, though, to the point you made about simplification, oversimplification, and contingent things, beginning to exist. Well, remember that I made a qualification, though, because I said, about humans, we're caused to exist by our parents. But I also made a distinction between continually existing. So you can still be contingent, even if you, for example, exist eternally. You can still be contingent so far as your existence depends on something else. So my existence depends on certain molecular structures, chemical structures, atomic structures, quantum structures at other lower levels, and then quantum structure depends on the laws of physics, for example, holding together. So that those are all contingent affairs. So it shows that I'm contingent because my existence depends on something else. So at every instant in which it exists. So even if you have an eternally existent being, which if I was an eternal existent being, then I would still be a contingent thing. So this idea of contingency is a lot more broader than it seemed like you understood, because I'm actually defining it in such a way that it actually applies to someone who may have existed, possibly anyways. I'm granting it for the sake of argument that you existed forever, or the universe existed forever, but it would still be contingent because it could fail to exist. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to exist. So it's not like the laws of logic or mathematics. But yes, so let me just go into some other objection here real quick. Kind of answered this already now because we kind of went through the objection, but an eternal universe does not need an explanation. So we know this is false. Again, just because you add eternity, just because you have an eternal universe doesn't necessarily mean that, it couldn't have been different. Why is it eternal, for example? You can still always ask the question, why is it eternal rather than temporal or finite? It could have been finite. Why does it have to be eternal? It doesn't have to be eternal. Just because you add an infinite scope of time to it does not remove the lack of explanation, remove the need for an explanation, right? So for example, if I found a ball, a mysterious ball in the middle of a forest, for example, and I'm like, well, why does that exist? What makes that exist? And someone may think, well, it existed forever. But at the same time, you might think, well, still, that doesn't explain why it exists, though. Even if you did say it existed forever, that doesn't explain why it exists. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be here.
Could the same not be said about God? Could it be the case that the ball just is the necessary being, or the universe is the necessary being?
Right. So that's why I'm separating this in two parts, actually. So remember, I in the first argument, I said it's necessary being. So, we don't know what that necessary being is technically right now. We could say
Gotcha.
it's some kind of physical world. We could say right at the moment, we can say all these kind of make positive, but we just know it's necessary. That's the minimal thing that we know right now. There's something exists that just has to exist. It's kind of like
Gotcha.
the laws of logic. So this explanation doesn't do justice to what we're trying to seek, which is an explanation. So for example, another good example, I think, is imagine like a pillow and a bowling ball on top of that pillow. Imagine that existed for eternity. So now you have an impression on that pillow. What explains that impression on that pillow? Well, it's going to be that bowling ball. So there is some explanation. Eternity, for example, doesn't necessarily remove that there's explanation. So we might still ask, for example, even if that bowling ball had an internal impression on the pillow, you may say, well, why is it on there? You know, it doesn't have to be on there. It could be away from there. So that doesn't explain anything. We still need some explanations there. Whereas, for example, 1 + 1, why is 1 + 1 = 2? Well, if you analyze the concepts themselves and analyze the relations between those concepts, you see that they necessarily entail that it equal 2. So it's completely distinct from, say, you know, the billiard ball on a pillow. You know, there's no internal explanation for why those things have to be there. Whereas for 1 + 1 = 2, there is an internal explanation. That's what necessity is. Necessity is an internal explanation, something that necessitates its existence, that makes it distinct. So second objection now, and this is what's going to be the second objection is one of the common ones. Like we see at Bertrand Russell says this. So it says the universe is a brute fact. So at this point, you're just saying the universe exists just because. You know, it's kind of like magic. You know, and it's like, so the meme here says like, "Are you a wizard?" You know, I guess, you know, you're just kind of magically making things into being and saying it exists for no other reason. So first of all, again, is that it rejects the PSR. We established the PSR is quite reasonable. It's quite plausible. You may not think it's absolute, perhaps, but it is quite plausible nonetheless. So you have to have some really strong argument for why you should reject the PSR. And simply saying the universe exists for no reason, that's what brute facts are, things exist for no reason, doesn't do anything. This is a common objection everything, so I have to really kind of go into this a little more. So second response I could give, if that's not entirely convincing, is that if reality is at bottom a brute fact, because that's what the atheist will say. Well, it'll say everything else has an explanation, but at rock bottom, there is no explanation. Whatever that rock bottom is, it just exists. You know, everything else is explained, you know, like you have evolution, all this stuff. They have like the scientific processes. Those are all explanations, but at the rock bottom, it just falls. Explanations just fail. We can't explain anything at that point. But if reality is at rock bottom a brute fact, then that means all other explanations are illusory. You know, we're not actually explaining anything. So again, you can refer to the pencil analogy if you want to see that. You're not explaining, like, for example, if I had a pencil and someone was explain, where'd you get that? Ask me, where'd you get that pencil? And then all of a sudden I go through an infinite series of, you know, of like, you know, people who to borrow from, and at rock bottom somehow, whatever that is, it just exists. And I'm not really giving the explanation, it just exists. You know, we haven't explained anything. Or say, for example, a wand analogy. Say, for example, you see a wand moving. You know, you're looking through a peacoat. Say you're in a Harry Potter universe or something. You know, you're looking, you see the wand moving, and what's causing that wand to move? Or you could say, well, it's another wand that's causing it to move. And it's another one that's causing it to move. And at rock bottom, you just simply, oh, okay, that wand just moving. There's a rock bottom wand, and it's just explaining. It's just causing everything else to move. But you're not explaining anything. You know, you're just simply saying it just does. You know, that's it. And under this kind of thinking, the third point, anything could be a brute fact. Because why not simply say, you know, oh, well, humans exist. That's a brute fact. It just does. You know, there's no explanation for them. Why couldn't you say that? It seems implausible. And so people might say, well, we couldn't say that because there's an explanation. We have the universe. So, I mean, we have evolution. So that explains it. So we don't need to appeal to brute facts. But then in that case, and then that leads to my fifth point, which is that possible explanations are always superior to brute facts. So as long as there's even a possible explanation, we should prefer the explanation over just a brute fact. So if, like, for example, we had no explanation at the moment, you know, at least no scientific confirmed explanation, say, of why this quantum particle behaved a certain way. You know, the natural expectation is, or what natural thing to say is simply say, okay, well, what are some possible explanations? And you say, okay, well, this particular boson or something caused that quantum to move. And that seems plausible, you might say. We don't know for sure yet because we can't do the particular tests right now because we don't have the machines for it. But that's a possible explanation. So you would prefer that. You would say, yeah, I want to investigate the possible explanation before I make any grand assertions that it simply exists as a brute fact. It does that for no reason at all. It just does. We prefer explanations all the time. So what we're doing here is that we're showing that there is a possible explanation of the universe, which is that it's a necessary being. That's a possible explanation. It's not ruled out. So simply saying it's a brute fact doesn't show anything. You're just kind of like saying, yeah, I'm not going to listen to your explanation. It's just a brute fact and it exists. It's not a serious answer, I think. And yeah, so sometimes I see this often though from atheists. It's at least from atheists that are following Bertrand Russell. I think that this is somehow a legitimate response, and it's not. It's simply to give up. Wave your hands and say, I give up. I don't have any explanation for anything, and that just failed. It just destroys science in the end, I think.
Gil,
what are we doing with science?
Wouldn't most people say that the universe isn't eternal?
Yeah, actually a good deal. Some would. I think they're split, actually, I would say. They're saying, most people would say that the universe exists, I guess, but then they would say something to the effect that, well, there is an infinite amount of multiverses that cause this one.
Right.
Or an oscillating view of the universe, where it's expanding, and then it contracts and expands and explodes again, multiple big bangs, it's doing that over and over again. There's certain views like that.
There's also the position that the universe isn't eternal, like it began when the Big Bang happened, but the Big Bang, like time did not exist before the Big Bang. So it was in a sense eternal. Like there was no point when the Big Bang hadn't started, it just started eternally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is definitely one view too. I think it has problems because if it's eternal, then it's timeless. And it's not timeless, then it has no way of changing. But yeah, I think that's one problem, because you do have to have time, at least to some extent, if you're going to have some kind of static world.
It'd be before the Big Bang. There'd be no time.
The Big Bang, yeah. So if no time, then time it's just, you have to still explain, okay, well, why did that particular thing occur? So you kind of still have to say something.
I don't want to pick up any of your presentation. We could talk about it later, though.
Oh, yeah, you're good, man. You're good. Okay, so let's go to the third objection, though, because this is also a popular one. You're going to see people quote quantum mechanics like it's some kind of magic wand to eliminate theism or something. It's always something that's appealed to, you see, but with atheists. But in fact, it's very heavily overstated. But so often we're trying to say something like, well, we have like some kind of, in quantum mechanics, we have things popping out of nothing, or it's appearing to do things without an explanation. We have quantum entanglements, we have superpositions, we have all these different things that seem very difficult to explain. And so you may think that, this violates the PSR, that, this shows that there's this, we don't seem to have explanations, but that's just a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. So first off, vacuum or quantum fields are not nothing, but are actually the lowest energy states of quantum theory. So they're not literal nothingness. They're not something that's coming from nothing, just for no reason. They're actually they actually are something, such as low energy states. So all activity the second point is all activity presupposes the law of quantum mechanics, which is explanatory. So all the things that do occur, like, radioactive decay or something, that seems to be kind of very heavily deterministic. It's very probabilistic. That's why it puzzles scientists, because it doesn't seem to be deterministic. It doesn't seem to have a deterministic route. Could go one way or the other. So it seems kind of hard to kind of evaluate which way it'll go, how will it decay, how fast will it decay. Could be like a 50-50 chance. So seems kind of random in a way, because we can't really seem to predict it. But that doesn't mean that there's no explanation now, because you still have the laws of quantum mechanics there, and it's in place. You have certain ways in which it's operating. So those are explanatory. So the thing about principle sufficient reason is that it doesn't say that all explanations must be deterministic. It simply says it has to be a sufficient explanation for those things. It simply says that it has to be some kind of efficient cause. So you could say there's certain conditions or hidden variables, for example, like Bohm's theory of hidden variables, for example. He proposes that there are actually hidden variables that we simply don't see that kind of causes this to occur. And that's taken as seriously in the scientific community. That's actually one deterministic theory. But even if we do consider the indeterministic theories, the theories that don't seem to make it that it has to be this result, or we can't predict it all the time, they're more about probability. Well, there's still probability. We still have there's still some kind of cause there, some kind of quantum field there that's at least providing some kind of explanatory scope for what's occurring. So it's not just happening for no reason. It's happening for some reason, but we just can't maybe fully, if our minds, be able to articulate that or discover it, because we're finite. So it's a complete different thing. And like I said, third point I've already said, there are different interpretations of quantum mechanics anyway. So deterministic and indeterministic. None of them violate the PSR because they're both trying to find an explanation for the activity that's occurring, just in different ways. One explanation, which is deterministic, is finding explanations that may make us able to like say, okay, this will definitely will result as an outcome if this condition takes place. Whereas indeterministic will say, well, even if that same condition was there, it could still take two different routes, but there's probability though. We can still make probabilities, make probability assessments and say, we'll probably do this more than otherwise. So there's a lot of things to consider in quantum mechanics, but quantum mechanics doesn't do any of these things. There's a lot of different theories, and quantum mechanics is mysterious. But again, this doesn't violate the PSR because the PSR is not saying that everything that exists, we will be able to find an explanation for it. It actually acknowledges that sometimes we may not be able to find an explanation because it's beyond our knowledge, but everything in itself has an explanation. So I think that's kind of settles. I could say a lot more, but I didn't want to get too complicated with quantum mechanics here because there's a lot to talk about. So I'm actually going to leave it up for more questions or discussions for a little bit before we go into part two, because part two, we're going to talk about the divine attributes. We're going to see why this necessary being has to be God. So do you guys have any other questions or points of clarification that I could explain for you?
I think all of my questions are probably going to be addressed in the second part, because right now I'm just wondering how you're going to get out of all of the criticisms you've raised with the answers of like the universe is a brute fact. How does that not apply to God? That's what I guess, which I guess the second part will probably answer.
Yeah. So God is not a brute fact. So he'd be a necessary being. So he'd have an explanation in his nature. But so brute fact is simply saying that there is no explanation. And usually, you know, all theists or all the kind of like philosophical atheists like Wyndham Smith, Graham Oppie, you know, those guys are kind of tend to say, yeah, there's probably an explanation, or at least they prefer to seek an explanation. That would be something that's necessary or something to that extent. But yeah, brute facts are definitely problematic, I think. But yeah, I'll get into that in a bit.
A question for you, Gil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hey, Russ.
Hey.
Russ East.
Whoa.
Hey.
Who's that? Who's that?
Someone who admires you, man. You're famous. I'll shut up now.
Oh. Okay. Hey, so when an atheist says, I don't believe in God, we say, first of all, that many atheists say that because, in essence, when they say that, they're admitting that there is a God. They just don't believe in him.
So are you asking what would most atheists say in response to that question? What would they?
I'm just wondering, like, would you say that there's a majority of atheists, have they gotten away from saying, I don't believe in God? Because in essence, right there, they've kind of admitted in that sentence that there is a God. They just don't believe. They have not embraced God.
I would say some of them might do. I'd say, but most of them, when my encounters of them, they would strongly deny that. They would say, when I say I don't believe in him, I'm saying that I don't believe in the existence of God any more than I believe in the existence of Santa Claus or any of these other things. They would say, so they'll compare it to that. I think majority of them would say that. Just to be fair to them.
And what percentage of them do you think don't even feel that even this topic of trying to figure it out is of any meaning? Do you say that most atheists that you talk to, at least a good majority of them will have this conversation like it's worth talking about, or do you get kind of a vibe that, this is just waste of time, we need to get on with something? I'm just curious, from your experience talking to, because I don't have a whole lot of experience talking to atheist, people or agnostic people.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my experience has been a little mixed. Some of them just use it as a way of debating. I've debated, like, for example, Tom Jump. It's kind of like their way to show that they're intellectually superior. They like to feel intellectually superior to theists. They like to be like, we take the baton of reason and you guys don't. You're looted, you're crazy, and they kind of feel good about that. And so it becomes like an intellectual game for them. Others kind of really do have sincerely seeking it. They do have an actual desire to ask these questions. They're like, well, I really just don't understand. Why do you think I exist? I think science seems to be perfectly sufficient to explain all the things that we see. So they're willing to have a discussion, but then there are others though, like you're saying, who just don't, they're just like, this is a waste of time. It's like me debating Santa Claus or fairy tales or something like that. They're definitely going to take that attitude. In fact, but it's interesting because like the new atheists, even though they say things like that, they spend so much time debating it and trying to refute it. And I think that kind of shows a little bit of, I don't know.
I always think it's worth it. Just to clarify, I always think it's worth it to talk to anybody. I was just curious from your experience, when the atheist is engaged in conversation, do you find most of the time that they'll interact with you and realize that this is an important topic to uncover, to unravel and everything? So that's just what I meant. So
yeah, I mean, it just depends on where the background is from, actually, because some of them might not give you the live day, but sometimes I'm able to talk to them and then they see that, wow, okay, you actually are able to explain why you believe more than most people. What annoys them is that when a Christian say, I just believe because it's faith, they really get annoyed by that. They're like, well, you guys are just superstitious. You guys have no reasons for that. So when I tell them my reasons, and this typically happens, and they're like, especially when I was in Pasadena City College, they're like really surprised. Like, you're a Christian and you're a philosopher. How does that make any sense? And then I tell them the reasons, and they're like, wow, you just flipped my view of Christianity upside down, they said, because I didn't think that you could have any reasons like that. And I really respect those reasons. So let them be able to ponder. So at first they may be very dismissive, but you have to work through that. You have to be like, hey, just give us a chance, like maybe I can be able to convince you otherwise. I understand that maybe the church has failed you in some way. Maybe you've had a bad experience, like Richard Dawkins did. He got molested as a kid, by a Catholic church. So there's a lot of different reasons maybe for that can bring that about. So we have to talk about them in a very personal way and see where their circumstances, what their story is, and then work from there, I would say.
But to be fair, though, on part of the atheists, I don't think very many religious people look into these types of arguments. I think it's a very small percentage of religious people who study apologetics. I think the majority of religious people, if you ask them to describe God's aseity, how he exists on his own, they wouldn't even know what the question is. So, I think we should be more fair to atheists. Like, I think most people who are atheists, at least, to a similar number of religious people are because they genuinely just think it's a reasonable discussion. I don't think it's because they were, molested as a child or they hate God. I think they just don't think that there's evidence for God.
Michael, I would agree with that, what you just said, as far as a lot of Christians don't understand why they believe what they believe and the reasons for it. But I think the opposite is just as true. As I talk to people at university, students, and you ask them why they believe that if they are an atheist or an agnostic, and you ask them how they came to that conclusion, a lot of times that isn't really well thought through either. It's just because my professor told me evolution explains everything, and that's it. They really don't have much more of a reason for why they believe what they believe either.
And honestly, I think that's just how most people reason. I don't think most people care about the truth. And so whatever religion or philosophy we're studying, that's how most of its followers are going to act.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's why, 500 years ago, most people were believers because believers were in charge of the system. And now more people are unbelievers because unbelievers are in charge of the system. It's just a matter of who's in charge and who's got more influence over the system. And people are more like sheep and they follow.
Yeah.
I have a question. So when it comes to control, do atheists try to refute Christianity because they're trying to because their worldview is don't seem to reconcile with with Christians' factual? Or are they really trying to? Why are atheists trying to make such a big deal in carrying down our faith? From a biblical standpoint, it's obvious, but from their point of view, why are they trying to, why are some atheists trying to make it their life's work to remove Christianity off the face of the earth?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, there's some who do, some who don't. So we have to take it individual to individual basis, I feel. But I do know that the new atheists in particular, the new atheists definitely devote themselves to that. people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. I think part of the reason is this: they think that it's just poisonous. It's kind of like they kind of see some kind of effect, like it's blind dogmatism, whereas they look at science as the epitome of like how we should be seeking truth, like testable prediction hypotheses and getting rid of our biases. And so they see religion as just simply a shackles, as something that's holding down humanity and keeping them in the dark ages, as it were, in this blind faith. And they think we could do much better without that. We don't need religion. If only people could see the truth. If we're interpreting the atheist charitably anyways, that's what I would say. And I think that several do, like Michael was saying. We'll actually say that. The new atheists, though, in particular, I think they're just unnecessarily bitter. They call people stupid. Like Richard Dawkins, for example, mocking. Yeah, so I think that's just too much. That's just too far. And I think there's a lot of bitterness there that can be explained by different other things, But if we're talking about like really honest ones, like Graham Opie, and Quentin Smith and all these philosophers, I think they're really respectful. Like if you watch their debates, they're great. I love them, So I would recommend watching them. But it's just that I think a lot of times there's a confusion, confusion in terms of they're not understanding the ideas properly, or they're kind of like, especially modernism. If you see modernism, especially modern philosophy, you see a much higher increase in atheists than you've ever seen before. And whereas in the scholastic period, especially, it's not just because of the church, but they had a lot of intellectuals. You had like Scotus, yes, Suarez, you had Aquinas, and atheism was relatively low. It was almost non-existent, I would say. So it's interesting. I think a lot of it has to do with the worldview in which you're coming from. Since we come from a world in which naturalism seems to be taking more and more prominence, and they're mistakenly assuming that since science has discovered so many of these things, that they can definitely discover the ultimate explanation of the universe, but they can't, for the reason I explained, because science is in the business of exploring and discovering contingent things, contingent explanations. So using science to say that, it's the end all, be all of everything, of all knowledge, is simply false. We have a lot of things that we know that science does not account for. Murder's wrong. You don't look through a microscope and see that murder's wrong. Right. That's something that is not accounted for. So there's a lot of limitations in terms of science, in terms of limitations of knowledge itself. Because science has to make all kinds of philosophical assumptions even in order to do science in the first place. So there's a lot of things that are going on, and people think science is like the king of knowledge, but it isn't. Philosophy created science. Philosophy, if anything, is the king of knowledge because it developed all these different branches. It guided the principles in which we are able to then verify our knowledge. Epistemology says, how do we know something? We study epistemology, we get to how we acquire knowledge of the external world, and that can help produce science. So there's a lot of different things that are going on in place there. And so when atheists is coming in it with this philosophical world, this worldview, they're born in this worldview, this naturalistic worldview, then they tend to see it in those terms. And so I think their thinking gets heavily muddled. Whereas if they came from more of a scholastic period, whereas a lot more clear way of thinking, we see a lot less atheism.
So are you saying we're departing from the scholastic view and heading more into a modernist point of view during these times?
Yeah, like relativism. I mean, I'm not saying that fully explains why atheism exists. Like it's partial explanation. You can have other explanations too, cultural reasons, psychological reasons, but sin, for example. But I think that this like intellectual, the framework in which we're understanding things in the 21st century is definitely a lot more different, a lot more loose and varied. It's like a buffet of ideas. People don't have like a solid system of thought like the scholastics did.
Yeah, I mean, I understand there are plenty of moral atheists out there. In fact, most atheists that are moral make an argument that they don't need, God to explain that murder is wrong. But with moral relativism, do you suppose that if atheism actually were to take over our government completely, like China or the Soviet Union, do you think they would possibly try to do away with morality, saying that morality is just a point of view?
Not necessarily. I wouldn't say that, actually. I would say it depends on the atheist. Some atheists are relativists, some atheists are not. So it really depends on what. I would say the ones who are not relativists are inconsistent with their worldview, but they nevertheless do hold that. But I don't want to get too far into that. I want to kind of get back into the divine attributes now. So if that's okay, I'm going to go into
It's okay after I say this. Theology, not philosophy, is the queen of all the sciences, my man.
The queen, yes, the queen. King. I see what you're doing there. Yeah, I agree with that.
I want to
though.
say one little thing. I have no. I'm not attempting to explain it at all. I think you explained it much better. But I just want to piggyback alongside on what Russ said and come alongside him and say that I feel what he said. I don't know how we can articulate it, but I feel there's like a qualitative difference between an atheist who says, "I don't believe in God." I've come across that, and I've come across atheists who say, "Oh, I don't believe in a God." And to me, the former is kind of like maybe Russ was intimating that the former is more like a one suppressing it in righteousness, like one who kind of in the same time he's saying that he acknowledges God. Like you almost want to say like, well, what God do you not believe in? But the other ones that are more purely atheistic, I feel, again, this is not really concrete, are saying, well, I don't believe in a God. And there's just a difference there between somebody who says that and someone who's like, I don't believe in God. I think it's like you do, but you still like him. But anyways.
Yeah.
Well, if they grow up in a monotheistic culture, then it'll just sound more normal to say I don't believe in God, because that's how people refer to.
Sure, it could be some of that. Yeah. I just feel like there's just a shade of difference there that I've personally sensed that I felt like Russ was maybe getting at a little bit there. But anyways,
I think for atheists, sorry, just like a thought experiment that I've kind of been thinking about for the past couple of minutes. People like kind of ask, like, okay, fine, you don't believe in God, but why do you make it like your life's work to be atheist? But so like approaching it from the perspective of an atheist, like put yourself in their shoes. If you believed that billions of people had been brainwashed into like a cult, wouldn't you want to expose that? I'm not saying that's what is true. I'm saying that's what atheists believe. They believe that all religion is just a cult. It's dogma. It's fairy tales. And so from that perspective, it's a very virtuous pursuit to try to expose that. So
the militant atheists are actually to give them credit, they're really concerned. They're really concerned. They think that the evils of the world are due to religion. We disagree. I disagree. But there's a certain virtue there. I'd grant them in that sense. I think they're mistaken, but you're right. They literally think that they're doing good and necessary work, right?
The question is, where do they get that moral prerogative from? Where does that come from?
Well, just the respect for truth, I would say. You respect truth. You want to share it with people. Why do you want to convert people to religion? Because you think it's true and you want people to have the truth.
I suppose. I guess where from an atheistic worldview, why is truth valued ultimately? What is valuable about truth as opposed to anything else?
And I guess that's the whole different debate of like, how do you have objective morality without God? Which we could get into later.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't want to be a party pooper here, but Gil, you've only got about 10 minutes left. You better get going.
Really? Oh man. Okay. I didn't even know this was time. Jeez. Okay.
Part 2. Let's go.
Define attributes. So we'll try to rush just a little bit. I'm sorry, guys. It's not going to be as thorough as I would like it to be. So what is this necessary being like? We know it exists. Why not something physical? Why not some lesser god or something like Zeus? So first thing, this necessary being has to be eternal. So that's just the nature of necessity, right? So like I said, again, like before, if the 1 + 1 = 2, it's eternally true. It's not just true for a temporary amount of time. It's true forever, eternity. It's timelessly true. So this being has to be eternal, because otherwise it can't be necessary. If it began to exist, then it's not necessary. It needs an explanation of its existence, and that can't be the case. So it has to be something that's not in time in a sense, and I can't elaborate that on as much as I would like to, because the Thomist kind of qualifies that a little bit, but that's just the general idea there. So this being has to be eternal. Now, second, it has to be immutable. So immutable just means it can't be changed. It can't be, it's in its essence, its nature can't change, because otherwise, again, this falls from the nature of necessity. If we're talking about 1 + 1 = 2, that just can't change. It can't by its nature. We're talking about the nature of the concepts and their relations to each other. It's immutably true. So in the same sense, this God, this not this God, but this necessary being has to be something that's immutable, and it cannot change. Otherwise, if it did change, you need an explanation for why it changed, why that changed, and why not another change. It needs some ultimate explanation. So then that being would not be a necessary being. You would have some other ultimate being, which is a necessary being, that would explain the change in that being. So that's why a necessary being has to be immutable. So we got 2 properties, eternal and immutable. And then now the biggest one is going to be it's immaterial. So this is where we're going to come into a lot of like debates with like LDS, and you may, especially the atheists, they're going to resist this a lot. But the big question is, what does matter? What does it take to be a physical world? What does it mean to be a physical world? So a typical conception of matter, especially in the modernist conception of matter, is that it's extension and quantity. So you have extension, and you have a particular geometric shape or form, and you have quantity of it. Those are the things that define what matter is. But if that's the case, matter is always changeable. You can always change in terms of its location. You can change its extension. You can change in its quantity. You can change in all different kinds of things that describe what that material thing is, what its quarks, atoms, all these other things. They could be changed in some significant way. So there's change there, but that defies, what should be in terms of necessity. But we'll get to that in a bit. So the second thing is whatever is capable of being multiplied, reduced, or divided cannot be necessary. So you can have more of the same thing. You can have more of the universe. You can have more atoms. You can have more photons. You can have more quantum particles, whatever it is, whether it's string theory or what have you. It's always going to be the case that it's going to be quantifiable, because that's the nature of science. That's the nature of physics. It's always quantifying the world. The world is inherently quantifiable. That's the view of physicists. It's inherently quantifiable. If that's the case, it could be divided. It has a potential to be divided. It has a potential to be multiplied or reduced. That means it's not necessary. Something necessary can't be made more. You can't have more of it in some sense. So, because if it did, and if you did have something that you could have more of, then you can say, okay, why not this much? So for example, say you had 10 quantum particles. Why not 11? Why not 12? If you can have 11 or 12, you can have more of it. You can have less of it. There's no reason why it necessarily has to be that particular degree and amount, without stipulating arbitrarily that it has to be that amount. Science is always it could always be more or less of something. So that means it's not necessary. Something necessary is not capable of being multiplied. It just has to be what it is, that it has an explanation of itself. Something necessary has an internal reason for why it is the way it is, but there can be no internal reason when it comes to quantifiable things, because you can always have more or less of something by definition. By the nature of quantities, by the nature of mathematics, you can always have more or less of something. So there can never be a necessary reason for why it has to be 9 as opposed to 8 quantum particles. So, and the third reason why it has to be immaterial is that it's easy to conceive of different kinds of physical worlds with different laws without contradiction. We can conceive of this easily. Anything you conceive, no matter what world you conceive, what multiverse you can conceive, you can have, well, why not a different set of multiverses? Why this particular set of multiverses? Even if it's an infinite set, why not a different infinite set of multiverses? You can always conceive of something different, no matter what you conceive of when it comes to matter. And matter is always inherently changeable, like I said. It can always be changed to have a different form. It could lose its form. Particularly the Aristotelian conception, I talked about potentiality. That's what matter is for Aristotle. It's that it has a potential to receive a certain nature, as a certain form. Now, I can't expand on that because it's a little technical, but as those are those two conceptions of matter: the scholastic conception and the modernist conception of matter. But both of them entail that it's being, that being is changeable. So our physical being, any possible physical being, has to be able to change. But that defies what necessary being has to be. A necessary being can't change, as immutable, as we said. It's internal. So it can't be material. It has to be something immaterial. So that's that. So now we have omnipotence. So I'm gonna go through this a little fast again. So we know that the world was caused, to be. It was this necessary being caused to exist. So it has to have power. But how much power? So if we say that the God has maybe, over 9,000 power level, but then he exerts his power to create the universe and then suddenly goes down because he has to exert his power, right? Then he changes, his power level changes. So we have to have a being that doesn't change, right? Because it's necessary. So it has to be omnipotent. If it's going to explain anything, that's why we have this necessary being, because it's there to explain everything. It causes things to exist and necessarily has power. But then that power cannot be finite, because then it could change in its power, So it has to be omnipotent. Something that's infinite, doesn't lose its power when it creates. So this is the most important thing. Intellect and will is what it takes to be a person. It's not just simply some machine, some thoughtless machine or something, some universe generating machine, as some maybe atheists might propose. So the reason why it has an intellect is, first, we know it's immaterial. This being is immaterial. It is not made of matter. So only two types of material beings, things that we can conceive of. It's going to be either abstract objects like 1 + 1 = 2. Those are laws of mathematics, laws of logic, or it's going to be minds. Those are only possible immaterial beings that we can conceive of, so at least plausibly speaking. So that leaves these two things. So what we decide, it can't be an abstract object, a necessary being, because 1 + 1 = 2. It has no causal power. The number one doesn't cause anything to exist, and addition and everything doesn't cause anything to exist. These are simply logical relations, you know. So something that's mind, with that mind, like we know our minds has the possibility to create things. It causes things to exist. We can create stories. We can do all kinds of things with our minds. So you may say, well, the mind is material though, and unfortunately, I don't have time to get into that. But you know, we do have ideas like, for example, of triangularity. You know, we have a general idea of what it means to be a triangle, an abstract concept. You know, it's not physical. We're not talking about, it's not in our, like, the idea of like a triangle adds up to 180 degrees. That's an abstract concept. We're actually grasping abstractions, and that's immaterial. So like the triangularity is not a physical thing. You may have physical individual triangles, but triangularity in general is an abstract concept. That's abstraction. So you do have some awareness of something that's immaterial, which is your own mind. So that demonstrates its intellect, but it also has a will that follows from the intellect. You know, if you're going to create a universe, there's all kinds of universes to create. So you have to have a will to choose, okay, I'm going to create this universe rather than that other universe. You know, so you have some kind of ability to choose universes. And that seems to be apparent because this universe didn't have to exist. So therefore this being, whatever necessary being is, has to have the freedom or ability to create this particular universe rather than another particular universe. You know, without being necessitated, because if it was necessitated to create universes, then that necessary being would depend on creating worlds to be what it is. And it wouldn't be necessary. That means that it needs to, in order to be what it is, it depends on creating things. And that's not what necessity is. Remember, it's independent. It's not dependent on anything for its existence. It is what it is, independent of anything else. So therefore, this being has an intellect and will. Now, this being also is omniscient. It has all knowledge, you know, so he knows all these things. And so why should we think that? Well, because now we know it's a mind, we know it's necessary. So it can't change, because if God changed, if God had what its being, necessary being, had more knowledge, then he'd be changing. He'd be changing in his essence in some way. He'd be learning something. He wouldn't be necessary. This being has to be omniscient. Otherwise, it will not be a necessary being. It has to know all things in order to create worlds. It has to know something, because that's what it is to be a mind. It's to know things. So that's why omniscient is omniscient. And it also has to be simple. So this is a Thomistic idea, but the idea, to put it more generally, is just basically God is not composed of parts. It doesn't have particular parts here and there. It's not an accident. God is omniscient and omnipotent and has all these properties all at the same time. They all entail each other, you know, and it's all part of God's holistic, unified being. And so he has no metaphysical parts, because if he had parts, you would need to explain why that part is there rather than some other part. You know, like say the part of a chair, you can always remove that part of a chair, the leg, the footstool out of it. It's not necessary that it has to be there. But in God, in necessary being, everything has to be together. You know, they all entail each other. That's, as we see, omnipotence, and eternality. That's all entailed by the concept of what it is to be a necessary being. Now, oneness. So one God to rule them all. So in principle, there's could only be one God. You know, it's not like this could have been Zeus, could have been some other God, or, you know, that ruled in. There's only one possible God. And the reason why we say that only one necessary being in principle is because think of how we distinguish between two different beings in the material world. So for example, say I told you that we had two identical pencils, identical in every single way to the microscopic aspects of that pencil. These pencils, they're so identical. You can't even distinguish them two. So how do we know that there are two different pencils? Well, the reason why is we say, okay, this bit of matter is there. This bit of matter makes up that other pencil. So those two pencils are distinct because they have different bits of matter. That's how we distinguish between two separate things that are identical. But then how we distinguish then something that's, or something more abstractly or conceptually, you might say, okay, an abstract being, like immaterial being like God, how would we distinguish between two necessary beings that are immaterial? Well, we have to make a distinction between its essence. We're going to have to say, okay, this necessary being has this particular feature, whereas this other necessary being doesn't have this particular feature. But then we have to ask, well, if that's the case, you know, that necessary being A and necessary being B could have switched their properties. So the property that necessary being B has and the properties that necessary being A has, they could have switched it. They could have both shared each other's properties and been distinct. So that means they could have changed. That means they didn't necessarily have the properties that they do. But that's absurd. Something that's necessary is not capable of taking on some other property and still being a necessary being. That's just change, that you're changing its nature. So in order for something to be necessary, that can only in principle, in theory, only be one God. And that rules out all polytheism. That rules out all these other gods. So this demonstrates that what we have here in summary, this necessary being is eternal, immutable, immaterial, omnipotent, has an intellect and a will, omniscient, simple, and one. This is what, as Aquinas says, what we all know as God, and therefore God exists. So you guys are free to ask any questions.
Good job.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to throw in a little tidbit there. You probably heard me say this before, but for those who haven't heard me say this, based on everything Gil just said right now, what do you think would be the best name for God?
Not to be unoriginal, but I am.
Amen.
Amen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exodus
I
3
don't
for
think
you.
I don't think there's any better name than that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
isn't it amazing that Moses writing how many years ago? He must have been some smart dude to come up with that name if he just came up with it himself. I mean, I am that I am. That's the name that God chooses for himself. Fits
Tell them
perfectly with
I am.
everything that Gil just said.
Moses
Yeah.
was a Thomist.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, that's what it's basically
acronym.
saying when we say I am. You're saying God is fullness of being. God is being itself. You know, there is
It
nothing.
completely contradicts Carl Sagan's statement, like I think, therefore I am, because because if you think it had to originate from somewhere, but because God did not originate from anywhere, therefore he is who he is, right?
I think if I am, yeah, that's a different thing. But yeah, you're right that God is who he is, regardless of us. But yeah, I think therefore I am is simply meant to prove that you exist, that you're aware of your existence. That's what Descartes was trying to show against the radical skeptic, that we can know
It was Descartes.
something.
Okay, I thought it was
Descartes was just basically trying to show that there's something we do know with certainty, and that's that I exist. That's why he said, I think, therefore I am.
You're right about Sagan, though, bro. Just
Yeah.
Yeah, Descartes.
Yeah.
Not Sagan.
Yeah, for sure.
It's awesome that Jesus said before Abraham was, I am.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, about, I think for Christians to come to the conclusion, as obviously Aquinas was, to say, therefore God, I think Aristotle was doing the same thing, and therefore his unmovable mover.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you go from the unmovable mover to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ?
Right.
Special revelation. Well, never mind.
Yeah, special revelation. So you'd have multiple things. So the first thing to notice is that since we've just demonstrated that monotheism is true, that eliminates thousands, if not millions, of religions that kind of regard that. Not that there are no truths in certain religions, but if a religion claims to be enlightened and claims to be the religion, especially, then it should know the deepest truth about the world, and that's that God exists. And it lacks, these religions lack that. So we have monotheism. So that just leaves like Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. We've kind of narrowed down quite significantly too. And I would say that when we analyze the concepts I am, we see that in both all three religions, actually. They kind of affirm that in some sense. But we have to ask then the question is, which religion was consistent with, like, for example, natural law? We're going to talk about morality. There's different things we can use to say, okay, this scripture conforms a lot more to the philosophical conception of God than any of these other conceptions. So we're going to have to also use, for example, the resurrection arguments. That's what we're going to get to, Christianity as being true. So we already made a big step here, though, in getting toward Christianity. In fact, I think this idea of God of being perfectly good, I was going to talk about his perfect goodness too. We know this necessary being has to be perfectly good, but I couldn't really get into that, unfortunately. We know that through philosophy, because, if God's not perfectly good, then he's less, he can change or whatever. You have all these different things, arguments you can use for why God has to be good, because he's being itself, and goodness and being are the same thing, just considered under different lights. So since God is being itself, he has to be goodness itself. I can't really get into that too much, unfortunately. But once we analyze that, we realize the Islamic conception of God is simply horrific. It's not really in accordance to what God has revealed himself as in nature itself, in creation itself. And that seems to eliminate that. In Judaism and Christianity, they just complement each other, at the end of the day. So the biggest difference between them would be the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which we can use arguments to demonstrate that, I believe. So
not to plug myself, but I think I'll definitely get into Christianity next week, and obviously talking about the New Testament and why the New Testament actually authenticates the Christian faith. And if the New Testament's true, if it's an historical account, if it's actually the Word of God, then that makes obviously that makes all the difference. So
yeah, no, I'm excited for that. We should all come and see it, guys.
All right, any other questions for Gil specifically? We can stay a few more minutes. I know Tom, it's past Tom's bedtime, so he starts getting cranky when you get past 9. But any other questions?
I'm good.
Okay.
Good job, Gil.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Tom. Appreciate you guys all coming out. So it was a good discussion. I enjoyed it.
If anybody has more questions or wants to talk about it further, then we can.
Yeah.
You
could definitely add me on Facebook. I don't mind it. Like I'm known for controversy on Facebook, so you can just add me, Gil Sanders. You'll go find me. Where I'm always debating. I have sometimes at times 200 to 300 comments on my thread, so just prepare for that. But it's all fun, so it's all interesting. You get to learn a lot of things. So if you want to talk to me, just contact me on Facebook and message me. I'll be more than happy to answer your questions.
Will you, Matthew, you want to pray for us real quick and before we sign off?
Sure. Father, we just thank you for this time together. Thank you for this fellowship together, Father. God, I just thank you for just allowing us to explore just some of these reasons for why we believe what we believe, God, why there's good evidence for your existence, God. You didn't make your existence a mystery, God. You didn't make your existence hard to grasp. You're necessary, God, and we fully believe that. Father, I just pray that as we explore what it means for you to be all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, all these different philosophical terms and theological terms, God, that would just be worship with our mind, God. Father, I just thank you once again for this time. Thank you for Gil and this excellent presentation, Lord. We just give it all to your glory, Lord, for your glory, Lord. Thank you for our time together. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Excellent, brother. Thank you, brother. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Gil.
Thanks, appreciate it, guys.
Next week, same time. Matthew will be presenting on the Reliability New Testament, so hope to see everybody then.
Okay.
Right. Thanks
Sounds
for
good.
coming out,
Thanks,
guys.
brother.
Yeah.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Good job, Gil, man. That was good.
Good job.
Thank you. Appreciate it.